Welcome to the Babylonian podcast. I'm Michael Light, and I'm a Second Temple Jewish literature junkie and a big-time Bible nerd. And on this podcast, I provide the perspective of Jews that lived just before Jesus, from texts that we have like the apocrypha, pseudepigrapha, Dead Sea Scrolls, Philo, and more. With scholars, sages, and scriptures, let's Bible on. In this episode of the Babylonian, I wanted to look at and explore the apocryphal Septuagintal 1 Esdras. Okay, let me break down what I just said. First of all, apocrypha. Apocrypha is a type of genre that is similar to the Bible, but not part of the biblical canon. Its later writings, especially those around the time of the Second Temple. 2. Septuagintal. The Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Torah, and then later the rest of the Hebrew scriptures, or the Old Testament. They were originally written in Hebrew, and there were very small parts of some books that were written in Aramaic. And at first, only the Torah was translated into Greek, and then later the rest also. Then, 1 Esdras. First of all, why do I call it 1 and not 1st? It is very wrong to call it 1st Esdras. Because if this is 1st Esdras, and then you read 2nd Esdras, and we'll get into the very complicated history of what 1 Esdras even means. Because 1 Esdras could actually be referring to, 6 different texts. And in the same way, 2 Esdras could be referring to 5 different texts. It could also be referring to one section of another text. 3 Esdras could also be referring to 4 different types of texts. It is just super complicated. But anyways, Esdras is the Latin translation of what we have translated into English, Ezra. The Hebrew name, I actually don't know what it is, but I'm pretty sure it's not transliterated, which means writing it in English as if it was Hebrew in a way that you would pronounce it in Hebrew if you read that English word. So it doesn't really make sense that we say Esdras instead of Ezra. That's just kind of holding on to the more Latin past of the Western Church. But anyways, so 1 Esdras is just one of many different Esdraic traditions. When I say Esdraic, that means concerning Ezra, having to do with Ezra, traditions that have to do with Ezra. So if you read 1 Ezra, and then you read 2 Ezra, and you're trying to find the continuity, first of all, 2 Ezra, what most people call 2 Ezra, and what most people call 1 Ezra, again, there are multiple different things they could be referring to, and I'll get into that in a second. They don't follow after. They absolutely do not follow after, especially if you're reading, as I am, for example, the New Oxford Annotated Apocrypha. If you're reading 1 Ezra, and you're like, okay, cool, and I'm just going to put this on the forefront, 1 Ezra is pretty much a paraphrase of 2 Chronicles, 2nd Chronicles, chapters 35 through 36, and then like Ezra Nehemiah with like specific chunks taken out and such, and with a tail in the middle. So you're reading that, and then once you read 2 Esdras, you get a story about Ezra getting taken throughout the cosmos. Mostly just having a Q&A with an angel, and asking him about the justice of God and everything, and about salvation and all these fears that he has. And so these authors don't even necessarily know each other, know about each other's works. 1 Esdras is completely irrelevant to 2 Esdras. Unless you were going to compare how different people thought about Ezra, but you can't read 1 Ezra and be like, okay, now I'm going to get a better understanding of 2 Esdras. It's a different text, different tradition. I hope this is making sense. It's pretty much like, apocrypha could be thought of kind of as extra canonical biblical mythology. It's myths that go beyond the Bible, so as to say. And really, actually, this is more of a pseudepigrapha, and I'm just putting this in my apocrypha season simply because I'm reading through the version of the apocrypha, quote unquote, that I'm reading. And again, I highly disagree with how scholars call the apocrypha an actual collection of texts rather than just a genre and a type of literature that's similar to biblical literature but is not canonical and found within the Bible and is written after the canonization of at least the Old Testament. That being aside, Ezra, all the Esdras, they don't necessarily agree with each other. It's really hard to find disagreements from what I remember from the other Ezra texts, Esdraic tradition texts that I've read. But pretty much they see this character Ezra, they really like him, they like his place in the Bible, or they find it appropriate to use that character because of who he is in the Bible to explore specific issues and such. For example, the author of 2 Esdras is really reflecting on the destruction of the second temple, not the first temple, but because Ezra was dealing with the creation of the first temple, he kind of reflects and projects that onto Ezra, and he uses that as a method for that. However, the author of 1 Esdras is writing long before the destruction of the second temple, and so he's ignorant of that, and that is not his concern. His concern, in fact, is showing how the second temple is mirroring the first temple. Kind of like, going back to 2 Maccabees, the insertion at the beginning of 2 Maccabees, the letter that talks about the tradition of the fire that continued from the tabernacle to the first temple and to the second, that puts the second temple at a place that the book of Ezra and Nehemiah really downplay. Because in Ezra and Nehemiah, which originally was one text, in the Tanakh, the original ordering of the Bible, that got split up, in the Christian tradition, which you still read it as one. But anyways, it says when the temple was built, that the people who had seen the first temple and how the fire had, and how God's presence was there and it rested on it, they see that God's presence does not rest on the second temple. And they're weeping, while everybody who is ignorant of the first temple is clapping. So, on the other hand, you have the tradition added on to 2 Maccabees at the beginning that precedes the actual story. And then you have 1 Esdras, for example, that's trying to actually compare the second temple and put it near to the same level as the first temple. But anyways, I hope that all made sense. If not, you don't need to know this. I find it helpful because when people say first Esdras, it's just important to know what they're talking about. Especially because, going from that into a new subject, and I will actually get into an introduction of this and talking about this text, which won't be very long, I'm thinking, because it's not actually all too original. 1 Esdras could actually refer to a whole slew of different things. So, in James Charlesworth's edition of the Old Testament pseudepigrapha, it's 2 volumes, really great, highly recommend it. From what I know and from the translations that I've seen of pseudepigrapha, these are the greatest translations. And there's some overlap with the apocrypha and pseudepigrapha. You don't need to know what the pseudepigrapha is. But pretty much there are other Esdraic texts about Ezra. And so, before the section of the different collection of Esdraic texts, it has a really helpful chart. And maybe just search up in Google Images, James H. Charlesworth, Table of Esdra Books, or something like that, and scroll down, and you can probably find this chart that has, 6 different rows and 4 different columns. So, I'm going to try and explain this the best that I can. So, this is a really great chart, and I'm going to try and explain it because it's so helpful for understanding, what people actually mean when they say this. So, in the columns, think of an Excel spreadsheet. At the very top, these are the titles, okay? There's number 1, in the furthest left, there's the Old Testament book of Ezra. To the right of that is the Old Testament book of Nehemiah. To the right of that is a paraphrase of 2 Chronicles, chapters 35 through 36, the whole book of Ezra, Nehemiah 7:38 through 8:12, plus a tale about Darius's bodyguards. That is the text that we will be looking at today. And then to the right of that, there is what they refer to as a Latin apocalypse. Okay, now those are all the column titles, the column headings. Now, when it gets to the rows, so we're going down, at the very top, the very furthest left, for the titles of the different rows, you have the Septuagint. Now, below that, you have the Latin Vulgate. Below that, you have many later Latin manuscripts. Below that, you have the Great Bible and the Douay Bible. Those are, I don't even really know what those are, to be honest. Below that, you have the Russian Bible, the Moscow Patriarchate. I don't know if I said that right. I'm ignorant of that as well. And then below that, you have a column that a row that shares Geneva Bible, Bishop's Bible, KJV, and RSV, King James Version and Revised Standard Version. Okay, so you have all those columns and all those rows. So, first of all, in the Septuagint, remember the columns and the rows. To Esdras in the Septuagint refers to both the Old Testament book of Ezra and the Old Testament book of Nehemiah together. Both those together is to Esdras in the Septuagint. Likewise, what we're reading, and I'm just going to continue, instead of saying paraphrase of 2 Chronicles chapters 35 through 36, the whole book of Ezra, Nehemiah 7:38 through 8:12, plus a tale about Darius's bodyguards, I'm going to continue to call that 1 Esdras. That's what the Septuagint calls it. And the Septuagint is the first of these. So that's what I'm going to call 1 Esdras. I'm just going to call that from now on. But just remember that that is actually a paraphrase of 2 Chronicles chapters 35 through 36, the whole book of Ezra, Nehemiah 7:38 through 8:12, plus a tale about Darius's bodyguards. And you don't really need to remember about what all that contains because we're going to be getting into that. And I'm going to be introducing that in this podcast episode. And then the Septuagint, go figure, is ignorant of a Latin apocalypse. There's no title because that's later. So the Latin Vulgate, the Latin translation of the Bible in the 5th century after Jesus' incarnation, the book of Ezra is called 1 Esdras. The book of Nehemiah is called 2 Esdras. 1 Esdras is called 3 Esdras. And a Latin apocalypse is called 4 Esdras. Okay. In many later Latin manuscripts, again, Ezra and Nehemiah are called 1 Esdras. 1 Esdras is called 3 Esdras. And a Latin apocalypse is called, has 3 different titles. Chapters 1 through 2 is 2 Esdras. Chapters 3 through 14 is 4 Esdras. And chapters 15 through 16 is 5 Esdras. Okay. In the Great Bible and the Douay Bible, the Old Testament book of Ezra is 1 Esdras. The Old Testament book of Nehemiah is 2 Esdras. And 1 Esdras is 3 Esdras. And a Latin apocalypse is 4 Esdras. In the Russian Bible, and according to the Moscow Patriarchate, the book of Ezra is 1 Esdras. The book of Nehemiah is Nehemiah. 1 Esdras is 2 Esdras. And a Latin apocalypse is 3 Esdras. In the Geneva Bible, Bishop's Bible, KJV, and RSV, the book of Ezra is the book of Ezra. The book of Nehemiah is called the book of Nehemiah. 1 Esdras is called 1 Esdras. And a Latin apocalypse is called 2 Esdras. And that is what we're going by, because that's what most texts are going to call them. For example, in the edition of the apocrypha that I'm reading, the New Oxford Annotated Apocrypha, 5th edition of the NRSV, this is referred to as 1 Esdras. Okay, if you didn't understand that, that's okay. We won't even be getting into any of those other texts until my next season on the pseudepigrapha. So, stay tuned for that. I know that that's coming quite a little bit of time, but sometime after my series on the Apocrypha. So, anyways, the Apocryphon of 1 Esdras. You can actually also call it 3 Esdras, or you can also call it 2 Esdras. 1 Esdras, 2 Esdras, and 3 Esdras. I'm calling it LXX, which stands for Septuagint. LXX is 1 Esdras. Now, as I already mentioned in this chart, what it says is that this is a paraphrase of 2 Chronicles, chapters 35 through 36, the whole book of Ezra, Nehemiah 7:38 through 8:12, and a tale about Darius's bodyguards, not in that order. And now I do want to remind you that you can actually find out what if this all links up with each other by going to thebabylonian.com or michaeljlight.com, going to the bottom and clicking on Apocrypha. And then you can go to biblical references and scroll down past 2 Maccabees, and you'll see 1 Esdras and the different biblical references. And there are it's literally just portions of 2 Chronicles taken out and then inserted into 1 Esdras. So literally chapter 1 of 1 Esdras, and by the way, 1 Esdras, if you want to read it, is 9 pretty big chapters. Just so you know. So it's, I would say, maybe around the size of Ezra Nehemiah. Oh, and interesting fact, this is actually, a lot of these Apocrypha I have read at least, I want to say 2 times. Some of them I've read 3 times. The Maccabees I've read 5 times. But 1 Esdras is actually the only text in this Apocrypha that I was reading for the first time. So, and also I've finished this. I'm recording this the day before it goes out, and I've read this some time ago. But I looked at some of my notes just so that I would remember and kind of come back to what I'm doing. And you can also see all my notes on the Apocrypha on my website as well, which is linked in the show notes. So, anyways, chapter 1 of 1 Esdras is like pretty much literally just 2 Chronicles chapter 35 and chapter 36. So, anyways, what it's doing is it's showing Josiah and King Josiah keeping the Passover. So remember, if you don't know, King Josiah is one of the faithful kings in Judah. He finds the Torah scroll, and that he needs to be obeying it and obeying Yahweh. And he brings Judah back, the southern kingdom of Judah back, and they all celebrate the Passover. Anyways, he ends up dying, actually, and then Israel is brought into exile. However, the book of 1 Esdras just doesn't spend a whole lot of time in exile. It talks about the Babylonians coming in and destroying the first temple. And then right after that, it talks about, in the first year of King Cyrus, sending the people out to go and build the temple. It starts out with Ezra chapter 1. And then he sends out the people to go and to build the temple. And so they go out and they're getting ready. And then, now in the actual text of Ezra, if you're familiar with it, or if not, there are Samaritans that come and they want to join. They say, hey, like, we want to help you build the temple. And Ezra, a lot of people can really read this guy as being the good guy and leading the religious reform. And I'm sure he had good intentions, and God bless his heart. But he sends away the Samaritans, who the prophets had prophesied would actually be joining the southern kingdom of Judah again. So they turn them away, and that ends up, they are angry and they're mad, so they end up going against them and leading the nations against them. So anyways, the nations write to King Cyrus and say, hey, actually, you should not be funding these guys building the temple, and in fact, you shouldn't even be allowing them to, because they have a history of rebelling against people. And so Cyrus says, okay, yeah, I looked in the records, these guys aren't going to build the temple. And that's found in Ezra. However, in 1 Esdras, they don't send away these people first. It's just that they're met by this opposition immediately. So up and through then, right, so everything is stopped. They can't do anything because, Cyrus is the world power and will absolutely destroy them if they do. And then it just says, okay, and King Darius throws a great party. And there are 3 young bodyguards. And, also at the same time, they all ate, they drank, and when they're satisfied, King Darius goes to his bedroom, he goes to sleep, and he will wake up again. It just says that. And there's 3 bodyguards. And they say, let's have a contest. Let's all have a contest. And whoever wins this contest, King Darius will give rich gifts and great honors of victory. He shall be clothed in purple and drink from gold cups and sleep on a gold bed. And have a chariot with gold bridles and a turban of fine linen and a necklace around his neck. And because of his wisdom, he shall sit next to Darius and shall be called kinsman of Darius. So, the funny thing about this is King Darius is asleep and he doesn't get to say anything about, oh yeah, like I confirm this is totally true, but they just say, yeah, let's do this. And pretty much what the contest is, each of them are to say whatever they think is the strongest. They write it on a slip of paper, put it under King Darius's pillow as he sleeps. King Darius will awake. They will all read out their statements. And whoever King Darius and all the bodyguards agree with the most will be awarded with this and will win. So they go through all 3 of these pieces of paper. King Darius wakes up, and it's just assumed that he knows what's going on and he's in with them. And so these are the 3 statements. The first said, wine is the strongest. And the second said, the second said the king is the strongest. And the third said women are strongest. But above all things, truth is the victor. So then the king wakes up, and he calls together all the people with him, all of the satraps and the generals and the governors and the prefects. And he took his seat in the council chamber, and the writing was read in his presence. And he calls these young bodyguards forward to present their cases. So the first person had said that wine is the strongest. So he says, the king can drink wine, and a poor person can drink wine. And both of them will become foolish and inebriated, and their minds will be on the same level. They're brought to the same level. And that's what makes wine the strongest. And the second one speaks, and he talks about the king. And by the way, the annotator for 1 Esdras in the Oxford annotated edition of the Apocrypha is Tamara Khan Eshkenazi. Eskenazi. I don't know how to pronounce that. But anyways, what she states is the second person is not actually giving a kind of polemic or argument against monarchies or against kings, which I agree. It seems right. These people aren't like Democrats. They're not for democracy. They grew up in a king, and in fact, this whole thing is elevating Zerubabel as the king, but we'll get to that. But anyways, that's just an important note for per se Americans who have a history of just really disliking kingship. But anyways, the second person says, well, the king is the strongest. The king sends out all his men to war, and people die for the king. The king makes people pay taxes, and all the people in the land pay taxes to him. Everyone must obey the king. The king is the most powerful. And then the third person spoke up, and there's no names given to any of them until this moment, in which case, in the case of the NRSV, this is put in parentheses. It says, and this third person was Zerubabel. And so now you can tell that this is probably an insertion of like an actual tradition where 3 people are arguing for what's greatest, and Zerubabel gets interpreted as being this third one, and you'll see why in a second. But what Zerubabel says is he says that women are the strongest. For example, the king. You think he's the greatest? Well, actually, the king was given birth to by a woman. Actually, let me read this, because this is pretty intelligent. I really like this, actually. Some of this. He says, this is chapter 4, starting in verse 14. And also, since this is the only entirely original part of this, if you want to just read this part of 1 Esdras, it's 1 Esdras chapter 3 through chapter 4, and that's it. But anyways, this is what he says in 1 Esdras chapter 4, verse 14. Gentlemen, is not the king great? And are not men many? And is not wine strong? So he seemingly agrees. Who is it then that rules them, or has the mastery over them? Is not women? Women gave birth to the king and to every people that rules over sea and land. From women they came, and women brought up the very men who plant the vineyards from which comes wine. Women make men's clothes. They bring men glory. Men cannot exist without women. And I will just say, as an interesting side note, that in 1 Corinthians, there's a part where, I believe it's chapter 11, where Paul has this whole thing where he seems to be saying a bunch of sexist things. And one of the things he says is, do you not know that men are the glory of God and women are the glory of men? Which is really interesting, because when it comes to epistles, in an epistle, you can be reading what the actual original author is just straight up saying. That could just be Paul saying that, or he could be quoting the people that he's talking to and then presenting an argument, and then he continues on to actually talk about how they say that it could be read as a slogan that the 1 Corinthians church, that the Church of Corinth is saying. They say that actually women are only the glory of men, and men are the real direct glory of God, which is interesting, because if he was reading the Septuagintal 1 Esdras, which I'm sure, as being a really well-read and intelligent Jew that Paul was, he was entirely aware of 1 Esdras, and that many of the other Jews that grew up on the Septuagint around him were well aware that, and also the Bible just straight up says that both men and women are direct images of God, and that a woman doesn't need to be married or connected to a man to find her glory. But anyways, the point being, this is a pretty good argument to say that Paul is actually quoting the Corinthian church there, to say that the Corinthian church they have that wrong, as well as many other things, like that women must cover their heads when praying, men mustn't. Other things going on. Lucy Pepiat has some good stuff to say on that, but if you're aware of that, this brings some really good perspective into that. If not, it's okay, but I thought I would bring that up because I thought that interesting. Anyways, he goes on to say, if men gather gold and silver or any other beautiful thing, and then see a woman lovely in appearance and beauty, they let all those things go, and gape at her, and with open mouths stare at her, and all prefer her to gold or silver or any other beautiful thing. A man leaves his own father, who brought him up, in his own country, and clings to his wife. With his wife he ends his days, with no thought of his father or his mother or his country. Therefore you must realize that women rule over you. Do you not labor and toil, and bring everything, and give it to women? A man takes his sword and goes out to travel and rob and steal and to sail the sea and the rivers. He faces lions and he walks in the darkness, and when he steals and robs and plunders, he brings it back to the woman he loves. A man loves his wife more than his father or his mother. Many men have lost their minds because of women and have become slaves because of them. Many have perished or stumbled or sinned because of women. And now, do you not believe me? Is not the king great in his power? Do not all lands fear to touch him? Yet I have seen him with Apame, I don't know how you pronounce her name actually, the king's concubine, the daughter of the illustrious Barticus, I don't know how to say that name either. She would sit at the king's right hand and take the crown from the king's head and put it on her own, and slap the king with her left hand. At this the king would gaze at her with mouth agape. If she smiles at him, he laughs. If she loses her temper with him, he flatters her so that she may be reconciled to him. Gentlemen, why are not women strong, since they do such things? Then the king and the nobles looked at one another, and he began to speak about truth. Because remember, women are the strongest, but truth is the victor. Gentlemen, are not women strong? The earth is vast, and heaven is high, and the sun is swift in its course. For it makes the circuit of the heavens and returns to its place in one day. Is not the one who does these things great? But truth is great, and stronger than all things. The whole earth calls upon truth, and heaven blesses it. All God's works quake and tremble, and with him there is nothing unrighteous. Wine is unrighteous, the king is unrighteous, women are unrighteous. All human beings are unrighteous. All their works are unrighteous, and all such things. There is no truth in them, and in their unrighteousness they will perish. But truth endures and is strong forever, and lives and prevails forever and ever. With it there is no partiality or preference, but it does what is righteous instead of everything that is unrighteous or wicked. Everything approves its deeds, and there is nothing unrighteous in its judgment. To it belongs the strength and the kingship, and the power and the majesty of all the ages. Blessed be the God of truth. And when they all stopped speaking, all the people shouted and said, Great is truth and strongest of all. And all of the bodyguards that lost had no reason to be sorry losers, but they all applauded him because he was intelligent and had great rhetoric and argumentation. So, Zerubabel, who is a descendant of David, who Haggai talks about at the end of the book of Haggai, who's prophesying around the time of the temple and how people need to focus on building the temple instead of neglecting it and building up their own houses. He talks about Zerubabel, and there's even an exalted kind of portrait of Zerubabel in Haggai chapter 2, starting in verse 20. In Haggai chapter 2, starting verse 20, it says, The word of the Lord came to Haggai a second time on the 24th day of the month. Tell Zerubabel, governor of Judah, that I am going to shake the heavens and the earth. I will overturn royal thrones and shatter the power of the foreign kingdoms. I will overthrow chariots and their drivers. Horses and their riders will fall, each by the sword of his brother. On that day, declares the Lord Almighty, Yahweh Sabaoth, I will take you, my servant Zerubabel, son of Shealtiel, declares the Lord, and I will make you like my signet ring, for I have chosen you, declares the Lord. And that's the place in the Bible where Zerubabel takes the most special place. In Ezra, he is the one who leads the first act of bringing restoration to Israel by leading the recreation of the second temple, of the temple, which is the second temple. But because he wins, Darius asks him, Zerubabel, you won. What would you like? And Zerubabel says, well, I would actually like for our men to be able to finish completing the temple as you had promised them in your earlier letter. And Darius says, well, yes, I will let you do that because you are wise and you won. And he praises God and he blesses him. And he allows the people to go on to build the temple. And then the book of Ezra continues. And again, it's not necessarily in order. One of the major things about this, and then after Ezra is Nehemiah chapter 7 through chapter 8. And so the last big takeaway from this is that it doesn't end with the end of Nehemiah. In the end of Nehemiah, everything goes wrong. You see that, and I think Bible Project's overview is really brilliantly well done. I used this for looking at Ezra and Nehemiah before recording this episode, and they also have a great, easy-to-read blog post on Ezra and Nehemiah and how it's not about leading a religious reform like we think it is, or it's at least not a leadership guide to it. But at the end of Ezra and Nehemiah, it shows how all the three movements in Ezra and Nehemiah had gone totally wrong. Nehemiah goes around and he sees that the priests have neglected their duties and they're no longer taking care of the sacrifices in the temple like they should and ritual cleanliness. Further, people are working on the Sabbath and people are still with their foreign wives. So Nehemiah's whole thing about sending away the foreign wives is gone wrong. Ezra's whole thing about getting people to follow the Torah by having a Torah marathon is all gone wrong. And even Zerubabel's building of the temple has gone wrong. And the priests that he instated and made sure that they had genealogies that they could confirm that went back to before the Babylonian captivity has gone wrong. And those priests have failed. And the people need a regenerate heart. Nehemiah, in a sense, understands this. In a sense, they thought that they could lead this religious reform. And maybe God would bring about that transformation of heart in their day and age. And he ends up seeing that that's not true, and he has to he doesn't have to. He's probably wrong in this. He's going around and attacking these people, making sure that they work it back up. Start working again and doing stuff the right way. And so it actually shows what a disaster it is, the Second Temple. That's how it ends. And so you can see why 1 Esdras is not showing that. It wants to put the Second Temple at a higher level. And it wants to show Zerubabel as a greater person who didn't fail and whose priests did not go on to do that. And so, and it's very possible that we can see this as a sort of way in which they're looking forward to the Messiah to come. Because it's always been someone from the tribe. This is really interesting, and I'm actually reading. I just finished reading through Exodus right now, and so I'll bring this my own personal reading of the Bible here. And I noticed that it points out that Bezalel, the head craftsman of the tabernacle, which is the quote-unquote first temple, he is from the tribe of Judah. It makes a point to say he's from the tribe of Judah. And then also from the tribe of Judah is David, who in the book of Chronicles is preparing all this material for the temple. In 2 Samuel, he's the one that prays to God and says, God, I would love to build you a temple. And God says, I don't need a temple from you. I've never needed a temple, but I will allow your son Solomon to build a temple. And his son Solomon, also from the tribe of Judah, because he's from the tribe of Judah, builds the temple. And then Zerubabel, a son of David, and also from the tribe of Judah, from which the scepter is going to come out, the king, the lion, as we know from the end of Genesis and from Balaam's oracles. We're looking forward to the Messiah coming from the tribe of Judah, biblically speaking. And Jews believed in that for sure. They also, many of them also thought there were probably going to be multiple messiahs. But the point is, there is a lot of reason to see this as them showing Zerubabel being an archetype for which the Messiah will fulfill, who will ultimately restore all of Israel beyond the temple, and God will come to dwell with the people like before. Similarly to how Chronicles, which is the end of the Tanakh, and not Ezra and Nehemiah. Again, I make this point in my last episode. I didn't even think about how that would connect to this episode of 1 Esdras. So you don't have to listen to it. But again, I think it's just awesome, and you should. And it's one of my favorite apocrypha. But pretty much, Chronicles is the end of the Tanakh. It's the capstone, and it's trying to show the genealogy that will be fulfilled, especially Judah's genealogy. Hint, hint, Zerubabel is from Judah's genealogy. These genealogies even go, I think, as Bible Project says, like 6 generations after exile. So that's well after the time of the rebuilding of the Second Temple. And yet, the end of the actual narrative of Chronicles, First and Second Chronicles are one piece originally. The end of it is King Cyrus saying, let them go up. which Ezra and Nehemiah tells the story of how that goes, and it's a failure. And so why does Chronicles end that way? Because it's showing archetypes. It's not showing David's failures or his weakness. It's showing the archetypal Judahite leader, and it's looking forward to the creation of the temple. And so we could see 1 Esdras as failing to understand how the second temple is not actually what was supposed to be happening. Or we could actually see it as, hey, obviously they understood that Zerubabel is not the Messiah. They're writing this sometime afterwards. However, they are well aware that when the Messiah comes, he will lead in justice, in wisdom, and in truth, and he will restore all of Israel, and he will have the favor of Israel, and the nations will come to him and to Israel and find their blessing there. And that is the hope of the Hebrew Scriptures, that very well may be the understanding of the author of 1 Esdras. So that's my introduction to 1 Esdras. You can find all my notes, everything else about the apocrypha, and the ultimate hub for the apocrypha, thebabylonian.com. Go down to the bottom and click apocrypha. Thank you guys so much for listening. Please, wherever you're listening, if it's YouTube music, I've been getting a lot of new views here. Give a thumbs up, or Spotify, give a good review, or also Apple Podcasts. Share this with friends. Share it as something interesting. Make sure to explore the rest of Babylonia, and I'll see you soon, again, in Babylonia.